Alright everyone, we start off today with a companion to a Substack article that I wrote yesterday. There will be a link in the description to that. You should definitely join me on Substack. I promise not to flood your email inbox. I'm only doing like an article every week, every other week or thereabouts. I'll also pin that on YouTube if you're watching there, so you can join me on Substack and read the article. I wanted to do a 2021 in review video now. There's still 2.5 days left in the year. So there's still time for something else terrible to happen. That's basically the analysis. It is one of the worst years in American history, in many measures. What I pointed out, though, is this. A lot of people are saying it was the worst year in U.S. history. I'm not sure that we can say that. Here's the thing. It really depends on where your focus is. If you look at the plethora of issues, all of the issues that could be of import, the economy, being subdivide that into inflation, joblessness, etc. COVID, pandemic response and/or human health. Technology, of course, technology over each subsequent year since the internet has been public has advanced rapidly. There's some backsliding in technology when we look at certainly big tech censorship. And I think that's arguably one of the main problems. Foreign policy, like Afghanistan, etc. When you look at each individual issue, with regards to most of them, I can't, in full faith and credit, I can't say 2021 was the worst. For instance, we can look at social alienation. We had race riots. We have skyrocketing crime. It's nowhere near as bad as it was in the 1970s or in the 1980s, crime-wise. It's not as bad as the race riots we saw during the civil rights movement that caused more damage, more deaths, more social alienation. But it is up there. It would be in the top 10 or the top 20 years for that metric. The economy. You can't argue the economy is worse than it was during the Great Depression. Shortages, or even necessarily the Carter era. You could say those shortages were worse and more prolonged. But you do have shortages, which is something in modern times at least, since the industrial era, tends to be not quite as much an issue. You have inflation. It's not stagflation, or at least not on the double-digit order of Jimmy Carter, although there's some fuzzy math involved with calculating it now, so keeping that in mind, that plays a role. But it's not the highest. It's not soaring Yugoslavia style out of sight. But you can definitely say it'd be in the top 10 or 20 worst years, or at least close to that. Of course, the Depression dragged on for a while because of FDR's fiscal policies. With regards to foreign affairs, we had a major foreign policy disaster with the withdrawal from Afghanistan. The country has effectively been handed to China. We handed billions of dollars of top-grade weaponry to the Taliban, and we stranded hundreds of people there. The legacy media is very reluctant to report on this. But if you look at the Vietnam War era, towards the end, we had several years where we had multiple major foreign policy disasters hit us one after the other. In the World War II era, certainly the same would be the case. The Civil War era. Social alienation. There's no way for me to claim that there's less social alienation in the Civil War era, or even the period leading up to it than there is now. The same would be true in some respects with the pre-World War I area. Of course, the U.S. emerging as a great power. There was a very large reluctance to enter into those affairs. I would even say into the 1910s you have a period of bomb-throwing anarchists and communists and stuff. By the way, the heyday of far leftoidism in the United States was the 1910s. If you understand it, and the 19-aughts. If you look at history, that's the heyday. That peaks at around 25-30% of the population. You're not going to be able to scrape together that many leftoids now unless you go to a handful of cities. So what I would say is that there are only two metrics on which I could argue 2021 was the absolute worst year. And of course 2020 technically on one of those issues gives it a run for its money. Kind of both, although January, of course, is when the asterisk administration truly begins. Election and inauguration are not the same thing. The first is that the President of the United States is incapacitated. The acting President of the United States is not mentally fit for office. The only other time we can say we probably had that particular issue was under Woodrow Wilson. That was over 100 years ago. He had a stroke, and of course for the latter part of his presidency, we think that his wife technically was signing documents for him. Technically that nullifies them, although if you don't know that to be the case, People just threw their hands up and said, well, we like the bill that went through, so we're not going to challenge it legally and make sure that it's actually him doing his own thing. The second is COVID. The COVID response under Joe Biden has been an abysmal failure. It's been a mixture of extreme authoritarianism that didn't do anything. More people have now died in the U.S. under Biden with COVID than died under Trump. This should be a big news story because they talked about it constantly and incessantly last year, but now, of course, they don't want to cover that news because Orange Man bad, therefore, ergo, Biden good. His policies have done nothing. The other day, he effectively threw up his hands and walked away from the issue. Which is funny. Of all of the issues you could have stood your ground on, COVID's the only one you're close to above water on. His approval's going to take another hit. That might be why he lost half point in the aggregate literally in the last 24 hours, if we look at the new slew of polling. Joe Biden has absconded that issue. He's said, fuck it. It's the states, they have to do it. I can't do anything more. Technically, he's right. It's too bad it took him an entire year to admit that. He's had numerous constitutional failures as well, but again, we've had other lawless presidencies. We suffered through George W., attempting to denigrate the First and Fourth Amendments especially. We had Obama attempting to denigrate the 10th Amendment mainly. Nixon, you could make... I know some people are like, no, Richard Nixon actually was one of the good guys. Okay, leaving the issue of commie entrenchment alone, spying on political adversaries is a no-no. So keeping these things semi-separate. We've certainly we've suffered for the FDR to the point where even his own stacked court shot him down. He was attempting to completely usurp government in the name of effectively making it a socialistic tyranny based around himself. Good thing he croaked. There have been Adams, technically, the second president that we ever had, passes the Alien and Sedition Act, starts throwing people in prison for insulting him. Effectively reconverting that element of U.S. society, attempting to turn it back into like a European monarchist system. Of course, gets ousted. Thomas Jefferson comes in. First thing he does is scrap that. So on any single metric, again, except for the president being demented and or the abysmal COVID response and the coronatarianism side of things, in all other aspects, I can find other years or even decades that are worse than 2021. It's when you preponder all of these things at the same time and say, okay, it's a jack of all trades year, a jack off of all trades in the sense of the Beijing-Biden administration. If you've got a 7 or an 8 out of 10 on the badness scale for pretty much everything you could have it on, that's arguably worse, because you'd think, even during the foreign policy disasters of World War II with problems economically, social alienation was lower. The population at some point was more or less solidified. Yes, there were always people who were dissident and said, you know, we shouldn't be in the war and stuff, but it was mostly drowned out. If we look at the social alienation of the 1950s, like the Red Scare era or something, yes, but it's coupled with a growing economy. It's the civil rights movement's there, you get race riots and stuff, but you know, other than Korea, which ends and then you're left with a decade of good growth, you're not in any active wars, although you start not long after sending advisors into Vietnam for no reason. If you look at the 70s, you have some alienation. Of course, you have the burgeoning gender war and things like that. You have inflation, you have shortages, you have the oil shocks. You have a foreign policy disaster, but I wouldn't necessarily class it as great as the Afghanistan withdrawal. Of course, the Iran hostage crisis, lording over the Jimmy Carter administration, not great. But the social alienation level was not as high, I think, as it is even today. If, though, I look at all of these different eras, I can usually find something worse than 2021, but I can't, on my honor, I can't figure out a year. I can't think of one, certainly not at least since the 1970s, where we've had so many negative markers. On that token, I would say it's one of the worst. I'm not sure whether it's the worst of all, and part of it really depends on what you give importance to. If you give grave importance to the president being able to do his job, like if you're worried, hey, you know, the bombs might fall at 6 a.m. tomorrow, so we need someone who's not demented, probably you rate this as one of the worst years because the president's not making the decisions himself. Joe Biden has Alzheimer's, his handlers make his decisions, he gets dressed in the morning, and it isn't his hands that are putting on his socks. He probably isn't even capable of holding his shit in. There are numerous credible allegations that he's pooped his pants on numerous occasions in the White House. Makes sense, his dogs apparently did that too. One of them's been put down. Probably the shitty one. Now he's got a puppy. So that'll distract the news media for a cycle or so. At the Vatican and so forth. If you are worried about economic issues, certainly 2021's the worst in recent memory. Most people in the United States weren't alive and old enough to remember the Jimmy Carter era. So certainly they don't have a frame of reference that involves the oil shock era like 77 or 78. So they're looking at it through the lens of the only other year probably nearly as bad as 2008 because of the peak recession and double-digit unemployment. Of course, that's been mostly reabsorbed, even not counting labor force participation. Again, though, it's up there. 2021 overall was a miserable year for the average person. I say this as someone because of the kind of work that I do, I've made progress. I then compare the increased income that I'm making with the inflation rate, and okay, I'm making headway, but it's not as impressive as it could otherwise be. It's worrisome because, at some point it's like, well, that $5.50 I charge for this book doesn't even buy a Hershey bar. Shit, well, now I have to go through manually and raise all of the prices. That's going to go over well with the audience, thanks to Biden. So hopefully he gets scooted out. Hopefully after the midterms he gets removed from office. We can get competent leadership in there, at least someone who's semi-sane. Give us something closely approximating sanity. I don't think it'll be a Democrat. That's about all. Peace out.